The history of Exeter is very tied in with the history of its churches. And we're going to be looking tonight primarily at the development of the churches in Exeter and how it revolves around the history of the town, the history of the country, and where we move forward from there. So we are going to begin with, it's mostly Christianity tonight. So I hope you're up for a little Christianity. It's Lent, so why not? Well, let's see if we go forward here. There we go. All right, Julia. All right, let's begin at the beginning. This is the Christian God. You can tell he's male and he's wearing a kind of a Roman toga. And of course, his son, very important to Christianity. But really, for our purposes, let's start with a brief, quick history of Christianity for you. Because in order to get to Exeter, we have to get through a lot of back history. Now, this program tonight was developed originally for Osher Lifelong Learning, and it was a 4-part series. Each of the 4 sessions were an hour and a half long. But don't worry, we will not be here until 1 a.m. We're going to get through it fairly quickly. Okay, so Christianity. The first great break in Christianity happens in 1054 with what's called the Great Schism. This is when the Eastern and Western churches break apart. And to the east, we have Eastern Orthodoxy, which evolves into Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, any of the other Orthodox churches based out of Constantinople, which is today Istanbul, not Constantinople. Yeah, okay. The other branch was Roman Catholicism, which is the church that was based in Rome. It adopts, the word Catholic itself means universal. It considered itself the universal church. The language spoken in that church is going to be Latin, which if you think about it would have probably irritated Jesus a little bit since his country had been governed by the Romans. But never mind that. So Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. We're going to let the Eastern Orthodox Church go its way. It doesn't fall into the Exeter story here. In the 1500s, there is a splintering of the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation, which breaks apart again, and Roman Catholicism continues on its way, and the Protestant churches, the word means protest, so it is a protest against Roman Catholicism. And then Protestant denominations begin to splinter off after that, and we see the various groups that we're going to look at tonight. The Lutherans, Church of England, which is the one that's going to be important for our purposes, and then all of the denominations that consider themselves Protestant today. That's as quick as we can do that. All right. Important to know that the Catholic Church had a number of sacraments that were involved. Baptism, confirmation, penance, Holy Eucharist, matrimony, holy orders, and anointing of the sick. The Protestant Reformation, anybody who considers themselves Protestant, probably has many fewer than this. And most of the time, the only ones that they will follow are baptism and the Holy Eucharist, or communion. Because those are the two that are in the Bible. That's why that happens. Martin Luther gets the whole Protestant Reformation going in 1517 when he nails his 95 theses on the cathedral in Wittenberg. These are all, it's a list of complaints, and he had a number of complaints. His biggest complaint, he was a priest, by the way. I mean, he was an ordained Roman Catholic priest. And his big gripe was the buying and selling of indulgences. You see, what would happen is if you were bad, if you were a sinner, you would be convicted to go to purgatory after your death before you could attain heaven. But if you wanted to cut your time a little short, you could buy and sell an indulgence. It could be an act or it could be something that you purchased. And the church had gotten very wealthy off of the buying and selling of indulgences, and Martin Luther took issue with that. It wasn't his only issue. He also didn't like purgatory itself. He didn't like the overworship of Mary. He didn't like the devotion and intercession of the saints, or most of the sacraments, monasticism. Particularly, he didn't like celibacy as a priest. I guess that was a big one. And he also didn't care much for the authority of the Pope. Martin Luther is from what we would today call Germany. So he gets everything rolling with his first complaints and a splintering from the Catholic Church. He is followed by Henry VIII, the King of England, who had a problem because he didn't want to stay married to his first wife, but he wanted to marry again. So we sometimes blame the Church of England breaking away from Roman Catholicism simply on the fact that Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, but there were some other very important reasons why the Church in England breaks away from Rome. And probably one of the things that drove them the most batty was the fact that anytime there was a collection of the cardinals to vote in a new pope, there was never an English guy there. Okay, and they really wanted to have some say in what was going on in the governance of the church, and they couldn't have that. So when Henry VIII breaks away from Rome, he becomes the head of the church in England. So it's called the Church of England. For our purposes, we're going to see it evolve into the Episcopal Church as we know it in the United States. All right, so that was his beef. And then there's John Calvin. John Calvin was a Frenchman, but he mostly did most of his work in Switzerland. Now, John Calvin is extremely important for Exeter because the first Christians who come here adhere to his doctrines. And his doctrines are, I'm going to run through what Calvinism was all about because it's fairly important for what we are going to be looking at. Okay, so John Calvin. Some excited people in the back. Okay. Basic teachings of Calvinism. The first one is the idea of predestination. At the dawn of creation, as God was creating everything and everybody that was and would be, every single human being's fate was decided at that point. Forever. Okay? And not everyone was going to get in. The basic ideas behind Calvin's teachings can be summed up in the phrase tulip, okay? Human beings are totally depraved. In other words, not so much that we're out there crazy, but that they're sinful by their very nature. Unconditional election means that at the dawn of time, God chose particular people, and you have no say in that. Limited atonement means only some people are going to get that favor. Irresistible grace means that if it is upon you, there's not much you can do about it once the ball gets rolling. And perseverance of the elect is that those who are chosen, or the elect as they're called, will always seem to come out on top. So to make that a little easier to understand, there's total depravity. Okay? If left to ourselves, we would all be in our underwear with the bucket of chicken. And it's all because of Adam and Eve, but it's mostly because of Eve, okay? Because she was the one that picked the fruit, we don't know what kind, we always say apple, picked the fruit and tempted Adam away from what was good. So she gets the blame for that, and because of her role in that, it was okay to marginalize women. You couldn't marginalize them completely because they could still be elect. There was one bit of equality in Calvinism, but you know, you could marginalize her a little bit because it was pretty much her fault. Unconditional election. Picture this woman as God, and she is picking the best apple she can find. It was unconditional, meaning that there nothing placed upon it. Limited atonement. Salvation only for certain people. An irresistible grace. God's gift to the elect, a feeling of inner ecstasy, intimacy with the divine, the sense of being at peace. Do you know this cat is? By the way, do you recognize him? That's Ugly Bat Boy from Brentwood Animal Hospital, yes. Ugly Bat Boy once knocked me out of I read a newspaper column, and every now and then, it's supposed to go in every other Friday, and every now and then they email me and tell me, we can't put it in this Friday, there's just too much news. So we're going to put you in next Tuesday. And it's usually okay. You know, sometimes it's topical, I'm trying to get it in. But this week they called me and they said, you know, we're not going to be able to fit, there's just too much news happening this week. And I pull out the paper on Friday and they're on the front page. It's this big article about this ugly cat. So I owe him a little bit, but he's so lovable, you know, that's a cat that's happy with his life. Perseverance of the elect. Once you're saved, you're always saved. Everything you ever do is going to reflect on your salvation. Everything you touch is gold. So one of the ways they could sort of tell who was elect and who wasn't was that the elect amongst you usually seemed to do well with life. They prospered. Fewer of their children died than other people's. They seemed to do well. They were really capitalists because earning a good deal of money was an idea that you were prosperous, so you had God's favor in some way. And the goal was salvation. You had no control over it, except you had to live a decent life, because if you were one of the elect and you hadn't realized it yet, then you might blow it. But then you probably couldn't blow it because of that irresistible grace thing. But anyway, salvation, everybody wants it. Nobody's really sure if they're going to get it. Heaven is where you want to go. Hell is not where you want to go. So Calvinism, which is mostly in Switzerland and in Europe, begins to creep into England. The problem that some people had, some of the English or the British had with the Church of England, was that to them it seemed like Catholicism with a little bit of reform. In other words, there are things that they didn't like about the Roman Catholic Church were still there. The clergy still wore vestments. There was still a great deal of money involved. They still had most of the same sacraments. They still had a lot of the same rituals. And people would say, you know, here we are fighting all these wars about whether we're going to be Church of England or Roman Catholic, and there's not that much difference. But there were people who were unsettled by it and wanted a more biblically based belief system. They break into two groups. One group, who are listed here as the Pilgrims, were separatists. They wanted to break away from the Church of England entirely and do their own thing and not have to pay taxes to support the Church of England and not have to participate in the rituals and have their own religious belief system. You couldn't do that back then. It was not allowed. The other group were the Puritans, who didn't necessarily want to break away from the Church of England. They wanted to fix it or purify it. Both the names Puritans and Pilgrims were pejorative terms. They were insults. It was like calling someone a bad name. Oh yeah, you're one of those pilgrims. You're going to leave. And both groups eventually embrace those names and say, yeah, all right, yeah, sure, call me that. I'm fine with it. Okay? So here's some of the things that they had difficulties with. The Pilgrims believed the Church of England was a sinking ship. They thought, it's like Catholicism, it's going to go down the drain. They didn't think it was going to do it very well at all, so they wanted to break away from it. First, they moved to Holland. Holland had freedom of religion no matter what. I mean, they were very free to worship whatever they wanted. The problem was that the Pilgrims felt like their English culture was drifting away. Their children began to speak Dutch, heavens. And they did not like that. They felt they wanted to start over in a new place. So they move on to Plymouth, Massachusetts. The Pilgrims are the ones that we see at Thanksgiving. They go to Plymouth, Massachusetts. They withdraw their membership in the Church of England. They're almost like outlaws living in this foreign country. And of course, the Puritans didn't like them at all. The Puritans, on the other hand, did believe that the Church of England could be fixed or purified. They tried to work within the system. They met resistance all the time. John Wheelwright is a good example. He kept preaching within the Church of England, but he keeps getting called up to task for his Puritan ideas, but he still considered himself a member. They really thought that they could work within the system, and when it became obvious that the best way to work within the system was to leave the system and do it somewhere else, they start to come to Massachusetts. The Pilgrims arrive earliest in 1620. You know that if you've seen the Plymouth Rock where they didn't land. It says 1620 right on it. That's the Pilgrims. The Puritans begin arriving in the 1630s. The other big difference between the group is that the Pilgrims, pretty much dirt poor. The Puritans, fabulously wealthy. So they brought a lot of resources. There's this huge migration of Puritans who come all through the 1630s. What's the big difference? Pilgrims are separatists. They want to break away. Puritans are fixers. Pilgrims, Plymouth Rock. Puritans, Salem and Boston, most of Route 128. Pilgrims, first Thanksgiving. The Puritans are the folks that came up with the phrase, "We shall be like a city on a hill, a shining beacon for the world." Pilgrims are the Mayflower. The Puritans are what's called the Great Migration, hundreds of different ships. And of course, the Pilgrims just wanted to be left alone, and the Puritans wanted freedom of religion for themselves only. Okay? They were not into sharing that with other people. All right, here's the Pilgrims. Thank you for your time. You are not involved in Exeter. Then there are the Puritans. These are our guys, okay? Even though they're going to toss John Wheelwright out on his boots. All right, to live the Puritan life. In many ways, the Puritans get a bad reputation because we call things puritanical when what we really mean is that's very Victorian. There were a lot of things that Pilgrims were heartily embraced that we tend to think that they would have rejected outright. Okay? The yes list, they enjoyed their food. They would have to. They ate mostly cabbage and peas and beans, but they did enjoy their food. But you weren't supposed to enjoy your food to excess. You're going to see a pattern here, okay? So gluttony was not a good thing. But food was okay. You were allowed to like your food. Sex was also a good thing. And the fact that when they arrive in New England, they begin to have very large families, like 13 children. Yes, obviously they loved sex. But you had to be married, and they had almost a 100% marriage rate. You had to be married. If you were anywhere on a spectrum that doesn't involve that, too bad. You were going to have to live with it. You were allowed to love your spouse. You could cherish your spouse. You respected your spouse. When a man and woman got married, they became one person, and that was the man. It was a system called coverture, where anything she owned, he now owned. Any decisions that were made, he made. This doesn't mean that women sat there meekly and didn't say anything, by the way. I mean, we just don't roll that way. So there was a lot of influence, but legally, she didn't exist. She wasn't allowed to speak in church. She wasn't allowed to speak publicly. However, he could sometimes be arrested for her crimes. But then he was allowed to beat her. So, you know. Church attendance was absolutely mandatory. They had very long services all day on Sunday with a break for lunch in unheated buildings. If I told you that in July, you'd go, yeah, that must have been tough. Okay, unheated buildings. Think about that right now. They'd bring little foot warmers with them, but you can't imagine what the cold must have been like for people in earlier times because we are so used to, I mean, the temperature in my house goes down below 60 and we're all complaining. But that would have been warm, almost hot to people back then. They were allowed strong drink. Yes, the water wasn't safe. They drank ale 3 or 4 times a day. They gave it to children at breakfast. They didn't drink coffee or tea because those weren't around. They drank ale all the time. Yes, it had a slightly lower alcohol level than what we're used to today, but they're kind of functioning on a low-level buzz all the time. They're also not driving cars. But drunkenness was frowned upon. Being drunk was a very bad thing. That was definitely sinful. So you could drink, but you couldn't drink to excess. I didn't mention also under spouse, next to that is celebrating holidays is on the no list. They celebrated no holidays. No Christmas, it's not in the Bible. No Easter, they don't know what day it is. No any kind of revelry holiday. Those did not exist. They didn't gamble. They didn't attend the theater. There's no theaters here anyway, so that wasn't a problem. They did not believe in poverty or asceticism, so you would not become a monastic person taking a vow of poverty if you were a Puritan. That was totally against what they believed, because prosperity was important. They believed in making money. As I said, America was founded on this idea of capitalism. It goes right back to the Puritans. They did not wear any jewelry. A wedding ring, for instance, was not worn. They didn't wear any other types of jewelry. They did like having a big house. They did wear bright-colored clothing. We have this view of them that they wore black and white all the time, but first of all, you're thinking of the Pilgrims again, and second of all, even the Pilgrims didn't dress like that. Black is a very hard color to maintain, but so they wore the colors that you would find in nature primarily, the things that you could make dyes out of. They did disagree with what was called foppish clothing, and the big trend back then was to have these big, giant, puffy sleeves and put slits in them so you could see the shirt underneath. Well, that didn't roll with the Puritans. They did not care for that, so you couldn't wear foppish clothing, as they called it. And they also didn't agree with withdrawal from the world. You had to participate. Participation in your community was very important. So these weren't the yeomen who would go live in the woods by themselves and only take care of their family. No, they had to participate in local government and schools and everything. very much involved. Here's John Winthrop, who is the governor of the first colonies in Massachusetts. He is the one who gave this speech, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us," on the Arbella before even leaving England. He wanted the Massachusetts Bay Colony to be this guiding light for the world. They would finally see how it was supposed to be done, and it was going to be done by a group of people who were pretty sure they were God's elect. Here's the seal of the city of Boston, which still has that city upon a hill graphic on it. Sort of. Yeah, I don't know how hilly Boston is anymore, but that was back then. Puritans lived their lives on this balancing act. The most important thing they had to deal with is the love of God. And the love of everything else had to be in balance. So if you walked out of the day and it was beautiful outside, you could appreciate that beauty, but then you had to hold back because you couldn't be you had to be too cautious about that. You couldn't love what was going on too much around you because your love of God was primary in your life. And then there's the problem of who is elect and who isn't. This weighed on people. You had no way of knowing if you were one of the chosen few or not. And it troubled people. So some people felt that there was a covenant of works, which meant that you went through a conversion experience. At some point in your life, you felt God's grace and you realized you were one of those people, or probably were, because if you said you were, then you were being somehow wrong just thinking that, so that was a little sinful in itself, but you had to kind of hope. But you had a conversion experience and you performed good deeds. You did the things that you were supposed to do. You attended church. You cared for other people. You earned a good living. You didn't overdo it too much. All those things were involved in what's called the covenant of works. The other belief that comes up, and it's going to come up important for Exeter because it's one of the things that John Wheelwright and his sister-in-law Anne Hutchinson believed in, is the covenant of grace. That simply by being one of the people who is receiving God's grace, you got this inner peace and you understood it, and so the little things didn't matter as much anymore. So it didn't quite matter so much whether or not you paid attention to every little tithing law, because you already knew you're in the club. John Wheelwright, I called Anne Hutchinson his sister-in-law. John Hutchinson was married to Anne Hutchinson's husband's sister. Does that work? You see? Okay. It was his second wife. So they were related a bit. And Anne Marbury Hutchinson's a remarkable woman. We should have whole programs on her because she's an amazing woman, a great theologian in her time, very well educated by her father. John Wheelwright, of course, was also very well educated. He went to Oxford, and he went to school with Oliver Cromwell. So he was really, he knew his stuff. And both of them get caught up in what's called the antinomian controversy. They were accused by the Massachusetts Bay Colony of believing in the covenant of grace, meaning that antinomian means against the word. So it means that they were believed to not be following the laws, that they felt they were above it. So they get convicted of this terrible crime, and they get thrown out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Anne Hutchinson gets into a little more trouble because she was a woman, and she was sort of doing these preaching services at her house. So as a woman preaching, that was pretty bad. John Wheelwright was a man preaching. That's pretty bad, but whatever. So they split up at this point. She goes to Rhode Island, to Providence, and he comes to New Hampshire for reasons we're not too sure of, why he picked New Hampshire, but he did. And this is how he comes to our story. There she is. Well, that's not really her. There's no pictures of her. I had to find something. Okay, but anyway. And that's John Wheelwright, and we know that's him because he's on the wall in the other room. The First Parish Church in Exeter, which is today's Congregational Church of Exeter, is the direct descendant of John Wheelwright's church as set up here in Exeter in 1638. The building doesn't go back that far, as you know, if you've ever read the door as you go in. But that church's congregation is the direct descendant of John Wheelwright. He arrives here in 1638, the spring of 1638, after having been thrown out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony the previous November. He spends a little bit of time in Dover, and eventually he finds his way here, and he begins to build the town of Exeter. So today it is a congregational church. How does it get from that very strict Puritan Calvinistic church to where it is today? A congregational church The phrase congregational means that the congregation is in charge. They choose their minister. They choose their form of worship. There's no bigger organization over them. So many of the churches in New England are congregational by their structure. Everything in Exeter remains this one church, which did not call itself the first parish church at that time. It was the only parish church. They probably called it the church. And that's the way it stayed for 100 years. Until something, Pam found me this great, I have to tell you other things about this too. Puritan influence in the town of Exeter. Here are some of the things that happens all across New England when congregational churches, particularly Puritan congregational churches, begin to form. Okay, they really have, our government structure here has not changed much since this time period. We have a citizen-led government today, just as we always did. Taxes at the time supported the church. We don't do that anymore. We'll get into that. Church law was the government law. Marriages back then were civil affairs. What this means is that they were not sacramental in any way. A marriage was basically an agreement between a man and a woman, and it really had very little to do with the church. The ceremony was certainly performed by the minister, but he was also pretty much the judge in the town, so he was the best educated person in town. So he was the one that would have performed the ceremony, but the marriage itself was pretty much a civil affair. And they did have divorce, too. You could split up. So they didn't have the marriage till death do us part. It was like marriage, because I need you to help me with the pigs and bear children with me. So they were very much civil affairs. Public schools were supported by public taxation. That's what the Puritans really leave us in New England. That's why schools are still important to this day. And they did that because it was important that every member of society, including the women, knew how to read the Bible. So that's why women get an education in early America and in New England in particular. Popish holidays were not celebrated. No Christmas, no Easter, nothing like that. We don't celebrate Christmas in this town until the 1850s, which is pretty recent. It's still a pretty new holiday here. And when they needed to solve a problem, they would hold a fast day. So everybody would fast. That's how you got things done. Married women ceased to exist under the coverture system of English common law. And of course, alcohol is God's gift, but drunkenness is a sign of weakness and a sin. We've had a conflicting view of alcohol over the years here in Exeter. Here's the cute poem. We were working the other day, and Pam says to me, you're working on that project about the Puritans. She says, so don't you remember? And she remembered one little line from this poem. This completely sums up the Puritans. I absolutely love this. And if anybody falls in love with it, I have a copy of it that you want. This was written by Gilman Ostrander in 1958. It was published in American Heritage magazine. The settlers of Massachusetts were of two sets, those by the grace of God elected and those rejected. One good way to tell the sainted from the tainted was that those whose prayers were heeded had succeeded. That's the one line Pam remembered, and I found it from that. As a rule, it therefore followed that the hallowed were favored upper classes, not the masses. Quite a number of the lowly acted holy, hoping they had been elected unsuspected. Others reasoned after learning hellfire burning was to be their fate forever, now or never. There were common people witches. Why so many turned out witches? It's a great little poem. Completely sums it up. By the way, we didn't have any witchcraft trials in Exeter. Bummer, it's ruined term papers for a lot of kids because they come in wanting to know about the witchcraft trials in Exeter. We didn't have any. For some reason, perhaps because we were kind of a wild lumber town for a while, we had a lot of people coming in and out of town. We didn't get that real insulated, you know how when too many people live in close contact and you never get out in winter is long. You just start getting resentful of people, and after a while it's like, oh, she's a witch. Okay, I think that's what it had to do with it. Because we were a seaport and we had people coming and going, you just don't see things like that happening quite so much. In other parts of New England, that does happen. Everything plugs along for about 100 years, and then a big disaster happens in New England in 1735, which has come to be known as the Great Throat Distemper, and it begins in Kingston, New Hampshire, when an ailment suddenly strikes. And this ailment is this virulent, swollen, throat disease. It was probably a very virulent form of diphtheria, which is deadly. And this particular strain was extremely deadly to children and to women who had either just given birth or were approaching birth, approaching childbirth. So it was very deadly for families. And because of the way that children were dealt with back then, in other words, they were all together at school, they sat together at church. When one of their friends died, the children were required to carry the casket to the cemetery and help bury that child. They were to look upon the face of their deceased friend to remind them, as this tombstone does with the skeleton on it, that you are mortal, and if you don't make the best of your time here, you could burn in hellfire forever. It was terrifying imagery that these children had, but they hung around together, and you know how germy kids are, so they passed it around. And the other two people that would pass the germ around was the doctor, who never washed his hands, and the minister, who went from house to house to console people as this was happening. And if you add to that the fact that in the Puritan mindset, you were not supposed to mourn when your child died, because it is God's will that your child is gone. Just imagine what this was like for parents, especially when a man might have a wife and 5 children on a Monday, the throat distemper hits, and by the following week, he may have no one. The minister out in Kingston was a broken man after this happened, and he probably didn't even realize he was helping to push this whole thing around. So genealogists are often puzzled when they come upon their family history and they see just this number of deaths all in one year. And it comes in waves, too. So it starts in 1735, and there's a whole huge number of deaths, particularly Hampton Falls, which is extremely hard hit. And then it settles down for a while, and then it hits again. And so it comes in waves, each time a little less, but each time it wipes out whole families of children. People began to wonder about this. I mean, what could be causing this? What had they done to bring this upon themselves? And it was very, very troubling. And it made people not so much question, but wonder, what is going on? Enter onto the scene a new form of preacher, the itinerant preacher. Before this, your minister lived in your town, you paid him. He was your judge, your jury. He was the one who made decisions. He was the one that called the shots. And suddenly there were these itinerant preachers who would come to town and without a fixed parish, without a church with pews, would stand in a field and begin to preach. Two most famous of these were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Jonathan Edwards was born in Connecticut. He preached a sermon, it's very famous, it's called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Now, he was a Calvinist. He believed hell was a real place. And he could terrify the people who were listening to him about what damnation was like. He was very strong then. But he offered a glimmer of hope in what he called a revival of the Christian spirit. He said, if you were maybe on the edge of one of the elect, and you had let it all slide because, I don't know, all your kids died last year, you could get it back. And when people heard his preaching, they were convulsed, and they would shake, and they would speak rapturously. And this is really scary to your Puritan townies, okay? Especially your town minister. The minister in Exeter gets so upset about this kind of preaching, he won't even let George Whitefield into town. He stands on the edge of town at the boundary and says, no, you're not coming here. So this kind of preaching was very alarming. But a lot of people thought, this means more to me than what I have been hearing. The other preacher, of course, was George Whitefield, who has very close ties to Exeter. He came here on numerous occasions and preached in town. He was an amazing speaker by the accounts that we have today. And when I first read them, and they talk about how he could preach to a crowd of 20,000 people, and I'm talking to about 30, and I mean, you can hear me. I'm in a building. I'm not out in the open standing on a barrel, but it must have been very difficult to, it must have been amazing to hear this man speak because he could be heard that far away. And this is a man who suffered from terrible asthma that eventually kills him, and yet he still could project that loud. Benjamin Franklin encounters him in Philadelphia, doesn't believe he can preach to 30,000 people. There's no way. And then he goes to one of his sermons and he couldn't believe it. Whitefield was originally from England. He was highly influenced by the preaching of Jonathan Edwards. He's also associated with early Methodism, so a lot of people who are Methodists will come to Exeter because George Whitefield actually preached his last sermon right here. Okay, so here he is preaching to the crowd, standing on the barrel. And here's the monument in Exeter to George Whitefield, close to where he preached his last sermon. It's across the street, up on Front Street. You'll see it, it's sort of across from a Phillips Exeter house. So you've probably encountered it if you've ever walked down the street and wondered what it was. But it is the monument to George Whitefield. There's a church that breaks away. There's some people in Exeter who break away from their church, which we call the church, which we are now going to call the first parish church because it was first. And they create their own church, which they call the second parish church. I guess they didn't have any kind of inferiority complex about that at all. It's like, we're number 2. But they broke away, and it was a very difficult process because you weren't allowed to break away. I mean, all your town taxes are going to that other church. And it took them a long time to at least allow the town to say, okay, some of the money, if you're in the first parish church, you can send your taxes there. If you're in the second parish church, you can send your taxes there. That little church stood up on Front Street. And when George Whitefield came in his later years, their pastor, by the way, was a man named Daniel Rogers, who had also been an itinerant preacher. He settles here, but he preaches in a style that's more similar to Edwards and Whitefield than to John Audlin, who was preaching here. So that church was up the street, and when George Whitefield came to speak that time, the church was overflowing. So they said, okay, we'll go out in front of the church. They go to stand out in front of the church, and somebody said his sun was in his eyes, so they put it across the street. I know, I've heard different versions of this. Anyway, he spoke to a crowd of about 2,000 people in Exeter, and he looked terrible when he was there. People kept saying, you need to rest. And he said, no, it's just my asthma's kicking up, or whatever he called it back then. So he decides he's going to ride horseback to Newburyport, which was the next place he was supposed to be, hoping that the night air would clear his lungs, which is not as crazy as it sounds. Many asthmatics have told me that. So he tries that, but it doesn't succeed, and unfortunately, he dies the next night. But because he preached his last sermon here, we have the monument. It was erected in 1888, by the way. The legacy of Whitefield and Edwards was the second parish church in Exeter, which remained separate from the first parish church until the 1920s, when the two combined again. They had a few churches. This is one of them. I don't know how well you can see it because our PowerPoint projector sounds a little ill tonight. But it stood pretty much right next to where this building is now. So it was on the front of the grounds here where Phillips Exeter Academy is. It's where Lincoln went to church when he was here. Okay, and then when they merged, the first parish church got the pew where Lincoln sat. That's why it's over there. So if you go to the first parish, which is not the first parish church today, it is the Congregational Church of Exeter. And if you go in there today, you will see the Lincoln pew, and you will also see the portrait of John Wheelwright. They have ties to both. If you could see this, and I'm sorry that you can't, this is an Exeter Town tax book from 1800. And right here, this person's paying their state, their town, and their parish taxes, all in one time. And they're paying the most to their parish. This person too, this person here. So you could pay your taxes to first parish or second parish, but those were still the only games out there. Taxes paid to the church. Can you imagine that happening today? We just don't do that in a civil society, and by civil I mean governmentally civil. Because they certainly weren't civil. There were people who were angry about this. Okay, there were a lot of people who were angry about this. Because after the American Revolution, that's supposed to be gone, isn't it? Maybe. The First Amendment says that there's supposed to be no established religion, and you're not supposed to stop people from practicing their religion. In New Hampshire, this was interpreted to mean, okay, the federal government can't establish a religion. Individual towns could. Sure, why not? That's not a problem. And it takes until 1819, before the churches in New Hampshire finally convinced the state to do what's called disestablishment. So the disestablishment movement in New Hampshire takes from 1789 until 1819, when the Toleration Act is finally passed. And during that time period, we still had state or local official churches in Exeter. And that's not the only thing. It takes a long time to break away. Okay. Historian George Barstow, this was his words for it, that people were compelled to pay for the erection of churches they didn't enter, teachings they never heard, and clerical labors which they conscientiously regarded as tending only to perpetuate the dominion of religious errors over the public mind. Who was mad about this? Quakers were mad about this. That is not George Fox. But anyway, I thought you'd recognize him. The Quakers had a hard time in New Hampshire. In fact, when they came to a particular town, they were frequently beat up, arrested, and thrown out. Sometimes the women were stripped to the waist and hauled behind a cart for miles and miles and whipped in each town as they were thrown out. People did not like Quakers. Why didn't they like Quakers? They were like everything that Puritans weren't. They believed in peace, equality, especially equality of the genders, integrity, simplicity, or as what the Puritans called rank heresy. These didn't like them. So the Puritans were anxious after the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution to be legitimized. Another group that didn't like it were the Baptists. Baptist movement in Exeter starts in about 1800, and they are not allowed to incorporate as a church until 1818. When the Toleration Act is passed, it still didn't allow all churches. It only allowed 5 official churches: the Congregational Church, which is what the Puritans became, the Baptist Church, the Presbyterian Church, Quakers, and Episcopals. So we're really sorry, Methodists, Lutherans, Universalists, you don't count yet. Those churches would then have to petition to gain legitimacy in any town, and eventually they're going to wipe out parish taxes being paid on your regular parish, for your regular society all over. In New Hampshire, in Exeter, it's a little bit tricky. There's some things they have to separate. The town clock was located on the Congregational Church. So if we were going to support the town clock, we still kind of were paying taxes to that church. So there were some little issues that were going on. Anyway, the Baptist Church in Exeter, the one that's currently next door, gets its start in as early as 1800. They don't build this church until 1874, but they were located pretty much right there and eventually down on Water Street for a while. Another early church was the Universalist Society. You want to talk heresy, talk about the Universalists. When they say universal, what they mean is universal salvation. It completely destroys the idea of an elect, because Universalists believed any good Christian could go to heaven, would achieve salvation. They didn't believe it quite universally, but not for other religions, It was Christians only in the early days. This church is built in the 1840s, and you probably know it's not there anymore. It burned back in 2003. And the Universalists were a very small group in Exeter, so small they couldn't afford their own church. So if you look at this picture, what you see is the bottom of the church is brick, and they rented it out to shopkeepers and merchants, and the top part was the actual church. So to help pay their mortgage, they took in tenants downstairs. Very clever New Englanders, I think. And eventually this building, the Universalists sell out to the Unitarians in the 1850s. The Unitarians sell it out to the Methodists later on in, I think, the 1860s. And then the Methodists sell it to the Presbyterians in the 1990s, and then the furnace blew up because the church was tired. Another church that comes to Exeter pretty early on is the Methodist Church, and this was actually on Portsmouth Ave. It's not there anymore, but it was at the time before. And then it moves into that church I just showed you, and then it's moved out to Epping Road today. This is an early church, and it's involved in the early abolitionist movement. I should have mentioned that the Baptist Church is the first fully integrated church, and what I mean by that is that they allowed people of color to become actual members of the church. The Congregational Church had allowed black citizens to attend their services in a back pew. But the Baptist Church actually allowed full membership, and in their record books, which we now have copies of, they're kind of bragging about that. They're pleased to do that. They will write with full membership. They also allowed women full membership, and then they have a little bit of an argument as to whether those full member women are allowed to vote on doctrinal issues. But they're getting there. The Methodists were, by and large, frequently abolitionists, and there is a big abolitionist kerfluffle that happens down at this church in the 1830s or 40s. They have an abolitionist minister who comes in to preach, and people hated him. Oh, God, they hated him. They hated him like people hate PETA, okay? You know, the animal rights people who sometimes are a little bit aggressive in the way that they approach it. That's what abolitionists were not very welcome. They were treated the same way. They didn't like him at all because even though we lived in a town that had a pretty decent African-American population, they still were not happy with him. They still felt like these were outsiders coming in telling them their business. And that was never welcome. I mean, we think that kind of thing only happens in other parts of the countries, but it happened here too. And then there's William Miller, the Adventist church, which we don't think, it's not on our radar, most of us. Today they're Seventh-day Adventists, because they're a small group. Actually has a lot of ties to Exeter, New Hampshire, in its very founding. William Miller was not from Exeter, but he did preach here very frequently, and they were usually large camp meetings. The early Adventists, who were sometimes called Millerites, followed his teachings, and he believed that he had calculated by using the Bible the exact day that the second coming was going to happen. And we know how well that goes, right? That seems to be something God is keeping to himself. But every now and then we think that we've got it. And William Miller was fairly certain, and one of his co-preachers announced it to the world in Exeter, New Hampshire in August of 1844. And I got the fun of helping assist a group of Adventists who came in a few summers ago trying to figure out exactly where that meeting took place. And we went through all the records to try and figure out where it was. So if you're heading out of town on Newfields Road, right after you cross Route 101, on the right-hand side, that's where it was. It's vitally important to the Adventist history, and it started here. So if you're wondering how he calculated all of that, this should clear it up. It's very specific. When it didn't happen, it was really quite traumatic to the people who had followed him. Many people had sold all of their goods, even here in Exeter, and they really believed that this was going to happen on this particular day at like noontime. It's called the Great Disappointment in their history. And later there's new dates that keep arising, and eventually they decided that maybe that's, it's soon. But the Adventists do have some very close ties to Exeter, New Hampshire. Now there's one group that you've probably seen missing, a group that's big now, but wasn't big then, because they were totally unwelcome. I heard murmurings. It is indeed. Where are the Catholics? In fact, I think we get to like session 2 and there's still no Catholics to be seen. I have to welcome back the people who take the class and say, if you're Catholic, thank you for coming, for sticking it out. What does it take to get Catholics in a Protestant town like Exeter? It takes industry. It takes the need for cheap labor. And it starts with the Exeter Manufacturing Company, a number of other mills and factories that evolve. And they begin to be created in this town at just about the same time period. I know this says 1827. In its earliest days, the mill tried, there's the mill. In its earliest days, they tried, like many other towns in New England, to hire farm girls to work. That system never really catches on in Exeter. It just doesn't really work out that way. We don't have enough mills to do it. That's probably why. There's a critical mass of people that you need to have and workers that you need to have to create a system that is that controlled. It didn't really work here. And instead, as the mills get going in the 1840s and 1850s, there are things happening in other parts of the world that contribute to why the farm girl system didn't work here in Exeter. One was the Irish potato famine of the 1840s and 50s. And the other was the overpopulation, if you will, of the Quebec region of Canada. And two groups begin to move into New England, French Canadians, or Quebecois, and the Irish potato famine refugees. Both of those groups are Roman Catholic. And that's when Roman Catholicism comes into the town of Exeter, as this particular groups of people start to move into the area. Just some factory worker pictures for you. This is the rubber step manufactory. Not kidding, that's all they made, was the little rubber step that was on a carriage when you stepped into it. That was their product. It's good to have a niche. And these are some mill workers at the Exeter Manufacturing Company. Notice there are a lot of women there, because women worked in the mills. This is Bishop James Healy. The Diocese of Portland is set up in the 1840s, and it's separate from the Diocese of Boston. The Diocese of Portland takes into account Maine and New Hampshire. It doesn't split into the Diocese of Manchester until the 1880s. But Bishop James Healy was involved in this particular point in time, and he's the head of the Diocese of Manchester during the separation, and he's the head of the Diocese of Portland from the 1870s on. He's a really, really interesting character, because you cannot tell from this photograph, and he would probably have never admitted it when he was alive. His mother was an enslaved woman from the South, and his father was an Irish refugee. And he was born in Tennessee, and his father, realizing that because the boys, he had like 5 or 6 boys, because his children were considered mixed race, and their mother was enslaved, they therefore were enslaved. His freedom did not matter. So he gets the boys out of Tennessee and sends them to Notre Dame in Worcester. That's Notre Dame, right? Yes. It's college. They're pretty young at the time. Holy Cross. Sorry, not Notre Dame. Holy Cross. I knew it was a Catholic college. Holy Cross. And I think like 3 of the boys wind up becoming priests, and James actually rises to the rank of bishop, so he moves on very far. There's some stories about him passing for white his whole adult. He had one brother who was much, much darker in complexion who couldn't pull it off. But the boys did remain free. His father was very desperate to make sure they didn't become enslaved. So it's a very interesting story, and he crosses our history in a fascinating way as well. Catholics bring a lot of differences to the town. For one thing, they celebrate holidays, and boy, do they like celebrating holidays. They bring Christmas to town in the 1850s and 60s, and it had never been celebrated here before. But that's one of their big things. And they celebrate lots of holidays, and they observe a liturgical calendar, and they're churchgoers. They do not miss going to church. That's very important. So it's a little bit different from what the Puritans were used to and what the Puritans thought they were going to be like. Here's the first St. Michael Church. It was on Center Street. It looks like it's very large, but it was actually very small on the inside, which is why they had to, almost all the churches I'm going to show you, their congregations have since moved elsewhere in Exeter, but they've remained in town. So this is St. Michael's, and it was here until the 1950s, the mid-1950s, when the church has moved up to Front Street, where you see it today, across from Linden Street. Unitarians also organized in the 1850s. I told you they bought out the Universalists. They have similar beliefs. They're a little bit different back in the time. Remember I said that Universalists believe in universal salvation. Unitarians reject the idea of a Trinity. So that idea that most Christians have of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all combined as one. You can make it look like a shamrock. It's got different branches, but it's all one. Unitarians rejected that idea. Unitarians rejected a lot of ideas. Let me just tell you how incredibly heretical they were, seen for their time. They rejected predestination, absolute truth, eternal damnation, original sin, and the Trinity. Yeah, not much. In fact, they frequently just thought of Jesus Christ as being more of a really good preacher and not so much divine. Things they accepted were free will, reason and rational thought, and the unity of God. They still would probably have considered themselves Christians at this time period. Today that's a little more fluid. Actually, Quakers are a little fluid on that too, but during this time period, they still probably considered themselves Christians. They actually bought out the Universalists, something that I think most Unitarians have thought, well, that was a good thing. They merged. It wasn't exactly a merger here in Exeter. It was more like a hostile takeover, because the Universalists had this church that they couldn't afford, and there were very few Universalists, but there were a lot of people from the Second Parish Congregational Church who were thinking like Unitarians and who wanted to form a Unitarian society. So they all got together in June of 1854 at the Odd Fellows Hall, which kind of makes sense, and they convinced the Universalists to sell out their church, and that's what they did. Yeah. Also in the 1850s, or 1860s actually, we get the Church of England comes back. You know, we had the Puritans who broke off from the Church of England, but now they're called Episcopals because they're in America, and America's separate from England. In 1864, there were 3 PEA students who are not pictured here. These are some other boys who we use because they look like the right age and it's the right time period. Three boys who were Episcopals decided they wanted to go to Christmas Mass and get communion, and they had to walk all the way to Epping. They walked all the way to Epping in December to get communion. And it was like one boy, and then he bumped into another boy, and he was like, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to Episcopal Mass." "Oh, really?" And they started talking, and they said, why don't we have an Episcopal church here in Exeter? Why isn't there an Episcopal club at Phillips Exeter Academy? And the more they talked about it, the more they realized they wanted this. And so they contacted Episcopal officials in Boston, who then sent one of the world's greatest missionary workers ever, Caroline Harris, who was from Portsmouth. She was not a missionary that was from Hawaii or something. She was from Portsmouth. This woman could really get things done, and she was a fundraiser beyond belief. She came to Exeter and pretty much gets Christ Church Episcopal started. She funds it. The Harris House is named for her, and Christ Church still recognizes her as a vitally important member. So in the middle of the century, we have these three groups that are technically Protestant, but quite different from the Protestantism we had seen in Exeter at that time. Very different. There's the original Christ Church. It was on Elliott Street. It was also Gothic, like the one you saw before. But it was also small, and I believe it's in the 1970s, they moved to their new church in Pine Street, which is where they are today. There were still some problems in New Hampshire. I remember I told you that we had gotten rid of the official church thing? Yeah, except our Constitution didn't show that. Our Constitution still required that if you wanted to serve in New Hampshire state government, in the legislature, or we call it the general court, you actually had to be Protestant. That doesn't get changed until 1877. By that time, there had been Catholics who had served in the government. They either were very quiet about it, or like John Letty from Epping, he was not quiet about it. He would announce, "I am going home to go to Mass because it is Lent and I am Catholic." He was pretty upfront about it. And it was before they changed the Constitution. I think by that time it was no longer enforced, which was probably a good idea, since we had so many Catholics moving into the state. Now we have this strange arrangement. There is one session on this which talks about conflicts of faith and some of the things that sometimes become a conflict. In the state of New Hampshire, for instance, when legislators were taking the oath of office, the oath did end with "So help me God," I mean officially as written, but you didn't have to say it. There was an out. You could instead say, "This I do under the pains and penalties of perjury." So you didn't have to swear an oath to God. There are some Christians who do not swear oaths of any kind, and so they had to make an out for that. By the way, the only president who has never used the "so help me," the phrase I do solemnly swear, was our own Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire. He was having a bit of a crisis of faith. And "so help me God" is not actually part of the oath of office for a president. It is something that presidents may do if they would like. But the oath of office is, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." And check it. The "so help me God" is something you can add. It's like, yes. So we don't know what presidents said in the past because nobody ever recorded it, but we know that most presidents, at least since Eisenhower, have always added it. And then after the Civil War, there arises a period when Christianity was still very prominent in the land, but there was this other thing that came out of nowhere. It's called spirituality. The spiritualist movement is very unusual. It has a belief in ghosts and spirits, and the Fox sisters really kick it off. They were from New York State, and these two sisters actually started in the 1840s to annoy their older sister Leah, okay? Rooms at night were dark. I mean, we talk about dark, but our rooms are not dark. They were dark. You couldn't see what was going on. And as they were living in this house that had a reputation for being haunted because people like scary stories, and these two sisters figured out ways of making noises and freaking out their sister. "Did you hear that? I think it was a ghost." "What was that?" "A tapping. Did you hear a tapping?" "I heard a tapping." They later confessed that they did it by cracking their toe joints very loudly. And they were able to demonstrate this in later age. It just creeps me right out to even hear that. But the spiritualist movement, this idea that you could speak to the dead, which is what it's all about, speaking to those who are deceased, becomes very important after the Civil War because so many people had lost husbands and sons and such. And so they wanted that connection. And often the bodies of their dead, there's a ghost, it's a spirit. Often you wouldn't see the body of your loved one because they were buried on the battlefield hundreds of miles away. I mean, the loss during the Civil War was staggering, the numbers of people who died during that war. And people really felt the need to connect with them. Even Abraham Lincoln and his wife, more his wife than he, were involved in seances and trying to speak to the dead. It's also the time period when photography gets very big. And so you see a lot of these spirit pictures as they start playing around, as if you could see ghosts only in photography, but not in regular life, you know. So you see a lot of double exposures like this. You see pictures like this. You have to see it correctly. It's a face, and she's got something coming out of her mouth. That's called ectoplasm. If it looks like a gauzy handkerchief to you, that's because it's a gauzy handkerchief. But all of these were used, and there was some comfort for people who really, really wanted to connect with their loved ones who had died. There was a great deal of comfort in it. You can't see this very well, and I'm sorry, but in Exeter we have no haunted house stories until the 1870s. And in the late 1870s we have one written account by a family that was hearing strange noises all night long. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it happens during the height of this spiritualist movement. And we don't know what it was that happened. They kept hearing these funny noises. They felt like the beds were moving. They are located, by the way, over by the railroad tracks, but you know, you'd know the difference between a train and the house moving. And it was very hot. They were in a time period in the summer when it was really hot, so no one was sleeping well. You imagine the heat without air conditioning and how badly you sleep at night. And you know, you hear things. So we don't know exactly what was going on there, but that's our one account. Mary Baker Eddy brings the Church of Christian Scientists to New Hampshire. She's from New Hampshire, actually. She's from Bow, New Hampshire. Originally raised as a Congregationalist, she later gets involved in the spiritualist movement, but later denies it and says that that wasn't what it was. What she did was she became very ill. She was injured, and she had an injury, and she actually felt like she managed to heal herself by reading the Bible. She wrote a book called Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, that many people adhered to, reading that side by side with the Bible, and they felt like they could gain a sense of better inner health, inner peace. You remember the picture of the cat? That feeling of just internal peace was something that she preached. So Mary Baker Eddy brings Christian Scientism to New Hampshire and to Exeter. There was a Christian Science reading room that was down by the Exeter newsletter office, and when John Templeton, the editor of the Exeter newsletter, didn't have anything else to write, first he'd go across the street and find out what was going on at St. Michael's Church. And they'd say, well, you know, Lent's starting next week. And he'd put that in the paper, Lent begins next week, as if they didn't know. And then he would check in with the Christian Scientist reading room around the corner from him. What are you up to? Oh, we know we got open hours at this. The Christian Science reading room announces. I mean, it was just, you can see it happening in the newsletter all during that time period is this like fill that he's creating anytime he doesn't have enough copy. So we know where it was. This is the Spring Street School. Why am I bringing up schools? Because schools and religion have had some issues for many, many years. Spring Street School, this is about the 1880s. This school was located roughly behind this building here and over to the side. I know these children look so lovely and obedient, so different from today's children. They have probably been threatened within an inch of their lives to stay still for this photo. You see a picture in the back of Abraham Lincoln. A schoolroom might also have a picture of George Washington in it, and it would have a King James version of the Bible sitting up on the front teacher's desk, but what it wouldn't have would be an American flag. These were very uncommon in schools until the very late 1890s. Every morning the students would rise and the teacher would read a portion of the King James Bible, which to many Catholics is what they would call the Protestant Bible. It was not the Bible that the Puritans used, by the way. The Puritans used the Geneva version of the Bible. They didn't use the King James Bible. But this was the one that was commonly used in school, and many Catholics felt that this was indoctrinating their children with Protestant beliefs and values. That was a problem. And then there was the Pledge of Allegiance that doesn't come in until the 1890s. The Pledge of Allegiance was originally written by Francis Bellamy, and it was written for children. And it was written to remind them of the trauma that the country had just gone through with the Civil War. Francis Bellamy felt that it's been 30 years, nearly 30 years, and a lot of today's kids don't realize what happened back then. So he wanted to remind them of the importance of that unifying feature. And so it was put out in a magazine, and children were encouraged on a specific day to all recite the Pledge of Allegiance as originally written. It has kind of a rhythm to it that works kind of well. I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands. And then it kind of falls apart. One nation, indivisible. The indivisible part is the most important part, because now we are one country. We're not the North and the South. We are one country, with liberty and justice for all. In 1923, and it becomes more and more common in schools after that, and it corresponds with a time period when there is a great influx of immigrants from Europe. In the early 1900s, the whole Ellis Island crowd starts coming in from many different countries, speaking a multitude of languages, and the American Pledge of Allegiance becomes more and more important. The DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, begin a push to put an American flag in every classroom. And once you had an American flag in the classroom, the Pledge of Allegiance becomes more and more a part of school kids' daily routine. The Bible reading starts to fade out, but the Pledge of Allegiance sticks. In 1923, they decide to amend it because they thought, you know what, some of these kids are coming in from countries and they're saying, I pledge allegiance to my flag, and they might be talking about the Greek flag. I mean, they may not know what country they're talking about. So they said, okay, we better be more specific. And they stick into it, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. Got that, kids? Got that? So they make it very clear. And then, of course, in 1954, when we were in a Cold War against those godless communists, under the Eisenhower administration, and remember that Eisenhower was a late-to-light convert to Presbyterianism, they approved putting in one nation under God. That gets added in 1954. So you can see how the Pledge of Allegiance has changed over time, and actually it starts from something that's pretty secular to something that has a little more religion in it by more recent standards, more recent times. This, by the way, was the original salute to the flag. And probably no one in here remembers it, because you would have had to have gone to elementary school in the 1930s, but it really and truly did start out, I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands. As you can imagine, that falls out of favor in the 1940s. I have met people who remember the Bellamy salute, but they said, just put your hand on your heart, okay, just do this. There's this great Girl Scout film called The Golden Eaglet, and it was made in, I think, 1919 or 1920. And you have this huge field full of Girl Scouts all going like this. It's a bit alarming. St. Michael's Parish, of course, had its own school to avoid some of the more Protestant influences that were involved. And it opens up in the 30s. I think it might be before that. I always get the date wrong, but this one's labeled 32, so we're going to go with it. By the way, this school we no longer have a Catholic school in Exeter. In the 1970s, the Catholic school was closed and sold to the town of Exeter, so Main Street School today is the old St. Michael's School. We just repurposed the building. Here's Father Cotter, I think, with some of his students. Anybody here go to St. Michael's? No, usually I have a few people that have gone there. It kind of messes with the Exeter Town Public Schools, because we have all of these kids, and then all of a sudden there's a whole mess of them that disappear and go to the Catholic school, and then like 40 years later they all come back again. So, you know, it's like trying to figure out where to put all these kids could be a little tricky. That's why they just bought the school. Okay, another thing that's changed over time is the motto that the United States at one time had, which was E pluribus unum, from many one. So from many states, from many colonies, one country. Used to be the standard, but they didn't used to put it on money. They didn't have enough room. In the 50s, they changed the country's motto to In God We Trust. So that doesn't go on money until 1956. Again, during the Eisenhower administration, that becomes important. And again, it's basically an insult to Khrushchev. I think we usually stick both of them on there now. So here's some of the Exeter churches. Now these are two church censuses that were done in 1885 and in 1987. So this is not current, but it's at least 1987, just to show you how it changed. The Advent Christian Church in 1885 still had 74 members, and members might be member families too. That's another thing we're not really sure about with this. They disbanded in 1966. The Baptist Church next door to us used to have 220 members, and they were down to 79 in 1987. I'm not sure what that is today. It might be a little smaller. First Congregational Church has stayed pretty much the same over time. They're probably about that today, if not a little more. Second Congregational Church is no longer in existence. It merged with the First Parish Church in 1920. Methodist Church has grown. The Episcopal Church has grown. St. Michael, because they've closed Catholic churches in other areas, has swelled. It's a huge community now of multiple towns. The Unitarian Church was down to only 39 members in 1987. They have grown. They're up to 100 and something now. I'm not sure what. And then there are new churches that have come to town as well. So these are actually just dates that they became a presence in Exeter. Baha'i, which is still here, formed in 1969. Calvary Baptist, which is, there are different Baptist churches. They can be independent, but they're generally in different conferences. So the one next door is the ABC, the American Baptist Convention, not conference. There are others, the Southern Baptist Convention, you've heard of that one. So there's different, not really branches, but adherents. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints comes in 1984. They're out on the Hampton Falls Road. Assembly of God, 1971. Faith Fellowship, Faith Lutheran, which I believe is now called the Regenerist Church. They're over on Elm Street. Fellowship Baptist. Jehovah's Witnesses came to town in 1963. Our Father's Family Church, that's the one over on Linden Street. You may go past it sometimes. The Community Church of Exeter, which I think moves around a little bit. I've seen it in various locations. The Christian Scientists disbanded in 1932 from this area, but they're strong in Dover. I think most Christian Scientists in the Exeter area probably go to the Dover Church. And the Exeter Presbyterian Church arrived in 1995, and they're now located in the old KFC hall. So there's a lot of churches still in Exeter for a state that is considered to be one of the least religious states. We got a lot of churches here. Okay, that's all I've got for you today on the theological history of Exeter. I could try to answer any questions. Julia, you can turn the light on. Anything that you need to know. If not, you can head out into the storm. Yes?
When the church up the street burned down in 2003, they were trying to move the bell. Do you know where?
Where is the bell? I believe right now the bell is at the town sheds. I think it's where it still is today. So it still exists. It was put there by the Universalists, and then as the church changed hands, it changed hands each time. The Presbyterian church that owned it at the time that the church burned doesn't have a place for it at the moment because they are in a place right now that doesn't have a bell tower. So I think they have donated it back to the town, but I'm not sure. At one time we're going to try and get a nice little park put up and put the bell in it. We can still do that. We'll hang on to it. Something good will happen. Yeah?
You mentioned that the church started out, the church was everything. I guess the head of the church is the head of the town.
We actually still had a civil government that functioned in the town, very similar to what we have today. They were called elders. Today they're called selectmen. And we had somebody who was the head of that for a while. We had an executive, but it all becomes what we have today at a very early stage.
So that's what they would all be church members of that church.
They would all be church members, yeah.
What happened when the second parish split off?
So did the governance? Well, that doesn't happen until like 100 years after they were first organized. By then, the civil government was quite separate. I mean, it was separate to begin with. The minister would arbitrate disputes rather than anybody else. There was no judiciary. If anything, he's serving in that function, in that capacity. And as the most educated person in town, he's the person you went to. If you were having a dispute about your cow, who owns the cow, he'd be the man that you'd go to. But in terms of governing, who decides who's going to be fixing the roads, who's going to be the measurer of fences, that type of thing, that was all the civil government, and that was voted on by the people.
Where did that come from? Civil government.
The civil government, well, that starts, as early as the 1640s. Yeah.
So, Barbara, didn't the Second Congregation build those churches?
They did.
In the 1890s?
They did.
Sold it to the Academy in the 1920s?
That's correct. She's reminding us that the second parish church was that one.
In architecture, they built an English-style Gothic church.
It's a Gothic-style church. That was designed by Ralph Adams Cram.
Yeah, but
right.
they're a congregation. And they're building
Yeah, it is a little different. It was a time period when most churches were built in the Gothic style. We're talking about the what's today called Phillips Church at Phillips Exeter Academy. It was originally built by the second parish, and the style that they're using is a Gothic style. Now, if you saw the other churches that we showed in the presentation, the Christ Church Episcopal was wood, but it was very Gothic. And the Unitarian Church, the one that is created on Elm Street after they sell the one on Front Street, is also in the Gothic style. And the Baptist Church, if you go to the interior, yes, it's also built in a Gothic style, very similar. Yeah, so that's probably what was going on there. I mean, so yes, it goes from that very straightforward, a Puritan church or an early Protestant church in New England would be very simple. It would have a pulpit, and there would be a place where the minister would speak from. There might be a sounding board over his head to make sure the sound would carry, but there really were no embellishments. They were throwing away all of that Catholic stuff. You were going to listen to the Word of God and the word of the minister, and nothing was there to distract you. Whereas a Catholic cathedral was designed to bombard the senses, everything around you, the color, the stories that are told in the glass windows, the incense that was to affect your sense of smell. It was supposed to affect all of you. A Protestant church, very different in its whole design and its whole ministry. Yes?
Having served on some town boards, I appreciate the Protestant radical notion of following, and that you have to hear all voices in order to understand the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
And, it takes respectful listening to all points of view to arrive at conclusions.
It's a very New England idea, isn't it? Yeah.
Education which sharpens
Right.
will have this developed ability to reason.
To reason for yourself, yes. And the fact that in New England what you find is that not only has education always been something that's very important to the general population, we consider it part of our job to also educate other people's kids. So up here, it's not considered rude to correct someone else's child. I have noticed this, because when I am out with and somebody corrects one of my kids, I'm like, you go. But if you try that in other parts of the country, people will get very angry at you. But we have very much, and I do this to my Girl Scouts all the time when they say something wrong, It's like, Haley and I, and they roll their eyes at me, and we just keep going. But they are used to that. It's the way we kind of cooperatively educate kids. So yeah, that goes right back to the Puritans. And they weren't stodgy by a long shot. I mean, we all this Victorian stuff, we blame it on the Puritans, but it wasn't them. They were very earthy people. Yeah. Yes, he would have, but he would not have ever admitted to that. Right. But he is today given credit for being the first African-American bishop, right? Because today it's something to celebrate. It used to be something considered somewhat shameful, which is a sad thing for his past. But yeah, so New England man. So. Okay, well, thank you for coming out on a cold night.